Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Polina Sadovskaya. I'm the Director of Eurasia and Advocacy at PEN America, an organization whose mission is to unite writers and their allies to celebrate the power of the written word and champion the freedom to write. This is our 18th PEN World Voices Festival and my 7th. Since 2005, the festival has stayed true to its original mission to celebrate the power of storytelling and literature in translation and to convene global voices across borders, language, and culture. Over the last years, PEN America has tracked an alarming rise in book bans across the United States. And our Freedom to Write Index tracked the cases of 300 writers who were detained or imprisoned around the world for their writing or exercising their freedom of expression in 2022. Now is the time to be #louder together. And to defend the freedom to write, read, and speak at home and around the globe. This week, we'll honor the power of literature and celebrate the stories that illuminate and interrogate what divides us and help us imagine new futures. This year, we are proud to present over 40 events featuring more than 100 writers over 4 days of celebration, dialogue, and cultural exchange. For those of you who are new to PEN America, I just remind you that we are a member-driven organization. We have members in every US state and chapter cities across the country, from Detroit to Tulsa and from Birmingham to Miami. And we welcome all of you to help bring our mission to life. Check your program for more information on how to join PEN America as a member. You all have it. We thank our members and, of course, our bookstore partner, Strand Bookstore, for helping us share our office wonderful work with you today. Finally, I want to share special thanks to the Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment, the Department of Cultural Affairs, the New York State Council on the Arts, the National Endowment for the Arts, and Amazon Literary Partnership for their invaluable support of our work. Now, I'm especially pleased to introduce our today's event, Women Writing War, and to welcome our speakers, Anna Badkhen, Lusine Kharatyan, Tamta Melashvili, and Marjan Moghaddam, for an interdisciplinary conversation on their work chronicling conflict and its effect on the civilians in war zones, as well as the effects of efforts at reconciliation. As someone who has just came from Tbilisi, a capital of beautiful, old and mountainous country, Georgia. I'm especially pleased to have writers from Georgia and neighboring Armenia, Tamta Melashvili and Lusine Kharatyan, at the World Voices Festival at the first time. So, Tamta Melashvili is an award-winning writer, activist, and researcher. Her first novel, Counting Out, received the leading Georgian literary award, Saba. Lusine Kharatyan is a writer and cultural anthropologist. Her second book, the collection of short stories, Dead and Forget Me Not, was shortlisted for 2021 European Union Prize for Literature. Lusine Kharatyan is also a member of PEN Armenia, our great colleagues and partners. Marjan Moghaddam is a renowned, pioneering, influential, and widely exhibited digital artist known for her unique and original style of post-human figuration animation. She is an Adobe artist in residence with Meta's Artist for Digital Collectibles, and she is a tenured full professor of digital art at LIU Brooklyn. Anna Badkhen is the author of 7 books, most recently the essay collection Bright Unbearable Reality, which was long-listed for 2022 National Book Award. Her awards include the Guggenheim Fellowship, the Barry Lopez Visiting Writer in Ethics and Community Fellowship, and the Joel R. Selden Award from Psychologists for Social Responsibility. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you for agreeing to take part in what promises to be a wonderful event. And our moderator for today is Pulitzer Prize winning poet and human rights advocate Carolyn Forché. So Carolyn is the author of 5 books of poetry herself. She's a distinguished university professor at Georgetown University and chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. So please join me in welcoming Carolyn and our speakers today.
Welcome. Is this okay? You can hear me? Welcome to tonight's event. I'm deeply honored to be here with these women writers, and we're going to be talking about our work and its relation to war. We have not gathered to discuss the history and state of conflicts we have witnessed, nor is it our brief to reflect on issues of war and peace, but rather to address the ways in which war has informed our work and practice as women, and the ways we have responded in the aftermath. We speak of war this evening through the prism of our gender, and we do not confine ourselves to the prosecution of war in terms of military hardware and battles, but we address violence against civilian populations, much of the time comprised of women and children. We concern ourselves with border disruptions, displacement, exile, care for the wounded and maimed. We concern ourselves with minefields and deforestation, rape and pillage, destruction of infrastructure, that umbrella euphemism for shelter, water, heat, light, food distribution, and security. War marks our consciousness. It incises our consciousness and becomes legible in the work written in the aftermath of the experience of extremity. So I would like to begin by asking each of our panelists to reflect on her experience of war, her relation to war, and the subject of war in her own work. And I'd like to begin with Anna.
Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much, Carolyn, for having me on this panel. I became a journalist when I was 19, and I covered my first conflict when I was 22. This was in the late 90s in the former Soviet space. And I was a war correspondent for about 15 years and wrote for mostly US-based newspapers and magazines from the front lines of Chechnya, Iraq, Afghanistan, the Middle East, which is journalistic jargon for Israel, Palestine, Somalia. And then I stopped being a journalist, but I continued to write. And I think having spent that significant portion of my life at the time in conflict meant that conflict is part of my life forever. I pay attention to it because it's what I grew up with professionally. And when I was invited to take part in this panel, I thought, well, what is this gender thing we're talking about? Why women at war? Why women writing war? I also became a mother when I was 21, so a lot of time, especially when I was a journalist, people would ask me, how is it for you as a mother? And I was like, well, I've never been anything else. So you know, how is it for me as a woman? Well, I've never been anything else. There is no control group. But what I was thinking about coming here was how when I became a writer who writes about war, I also had to become a reader who reads about war. And as a reader, mostly an Anglophone reader, because I was exclusively an Anglophone writer. I read Richard Kapuscinski in translation. I read Michael Herr. I read Chatwin. I read Thesiger. I read men. And I think that for me, and I'm much older now, for me, the significance of women writing war today is that the women who come after us don't have to read Kapuscinski or Chatwin or Thesiger. All men with sometimes questionable ethics, because they can read works by women who write about war. I think that was under 4 minutes. How did I do?
Tamta, would you like to?
Hello, firstly. So I come from Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, and I don't really know how the audience is familiar with my country. And I'm usually in these situations, I'm usually always lost because I don't know how much should I tell you about the context. But at least you can Google Georgia and find out what's. But to say very briefly, I was born in Soviet Union. I was Soviet child for 10 years, and then we gained independence. And since then we had 3 wars, like 2 wars with the secessionist regions, 1 civil war, and the last one was Russian-Georgian war in 2008. I myself did not experience this direct like this military combat, but of course I was the part of the setting, and as Carolyn said, war really marks consciousness. And I also, I think that I may sound very pathetic, but still I will say that war is something that gives us a wound, which is very difficult, or sometimes it's impossible to heal. And I somehow tried to deal with this wound with my first novel, which I wrote 13 years ago as my response to Georgian-Russian war. And it's about teenage girls' experience in a conflict zone. So by then I was totally inexperienced writer, but I wanted somehow to show this girls' perspective of the war. And as I said, it was also, maybe unconsciously, it was also my attempt to somehow to deal with the wound I think I still have on my body.
Thank you. Lusine?
Okay. So my experience is more or less similar to Tamta's experience in terms of coming from Armenia, which is exactly the same region where Georgia is located, and being in war situation since independence, early 90s until now, because we have this unresolved conflict which basically affects every aspect of our life until now. So whatever you do, you live under the shadow of that unresolved conflict. Even today, before coming here, I have learned that there was one, again, there were clashes on the border, and one young guy, 19 years old, just died. So it's every day in your life, wherever you are not distanced from that. And just bring more perspective in one of my, in my last novel, which is still underway, I have this character, a protagonist. She is a woman, and she always prays for her loved ones and for her children, because she's this woman. It's like her life evolves throughout the novel, and every time she goes to pray for her son, for her husband, for this and that, and she asks, from the beginning, she asks for a son who is in military. She asks God to save him. then she asks for her husband, then she asks for her relatives. So this person, she's always praying, and it's years long. And every time when she goes to church, she also prays for leaders of her country to have wisdom, to stop conflict, to not go into fight. So she prays for local leaders, but also she prays for global leaders. And she starts with Bush and Putin, then she goes with Obama and Putin, and then she goes with Trump and Putin, and then she goes with Biden and Putin. So this is very much about our region and about our unresolved conflict, when there is this one thing that never changes, but you perceive that it has to do, whatever problems you are having, it has to do with your local leaders, but more than that, it has to do with this unchanging I mean, something you personally cannot affect, you personally cannot change. Basically, I think this is more or less about my perspective into that, in addition to many other more personal things and stories that are in my writing. I think this protagonist speaks about what women mostly experience also.
Thank you, Marjan.
Hi, I'm actually the visual artist on this panel, and some of you might be wondering, why do we have a digital artist on this panel? The reason is, well, I have actually used embedded writing, poetry and prose in some of my work, animations, large format prints, etc. And I'm originally from Iran. I was, born and raised there before the revolution. And I went to international school, so I was raised multilingual. But I lived through the 1978 revolution in Iran. And, our house was close to the TV station. And so all the revolutionary groups were always fighting to take over the TV station and declare that they were in charge of the government. And so, my parents were also getting a divorce to make matters worse. And my older brother was in the military at that time. My father was in hiding, and my mom was ill, and I was 17 years old. And I became, I had to step into becoming a parent at the age of 17. So I was the one that was, had to go out and get food and find out who was fighting who and what was going on. And unfortunately, that meant I had to witness a lot of the violence. And, I came to the US in September of 1979, and, much of my life was affected by these wounds. And for a very long time, I did work that had nothing to do with those experiences. It was like I was doing, just the fact that I became an early pioneering computer artist. I'm actually going to have a show in Berlin as female pioneers of computer art next week, by the way. But one of the reasons I embraced computer technology was because I was pushing away from the regressive forces that had taken over my country, and I was sort of projecting all this utopianism onto technology and just throwing myself into it. And it wasn't until, I was in my late 40s. I was approaching 50 when I did my Of Revolutions collection of large format prints, animations, etc. And that had a lot of the embedded writing. And I realized that those 20 or 30 years that I was trying to process the PTSD and deal with it and sit with the feelings, I realized that that was a process of forgiveness and slow motion, as I called it. And I think for me as a woman, and I think every woman has a different experience, the forgiveness is the part of it. Because I had to first forgive myself for refusing to feel things. And then I had to forgive what had happened, because if I didn't, I would go insane. And then I had to realize what Rumi says, that the wound is where the light enters you. And I had to realize that it's up to me to find the meaning, the forgiveness that allows the meaning, that's about transcending this experience. So that's it for me.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. I'm curious about what difference does it make to be a woman rather than a man in war zones or in considering conflict or warfare in the work. And because you raised the issue of the male writers, I'd like to start with you, Anna. What, in your own personal experience, what difference did it make that when you were in these various situations that you were a woman? How did it help you? How did it challenge you? Can you tell us about that?
Sure. With the caveat that I've never been a man in these situations, so I can't really, there is no control group. In many, so let's start with the idea that in today's neo-colonial world, divided capitalist world, conflicts, live conflicts happen for the most part in the countries of global majority. And let's also agree with the premise that in these countries, gender roles are fairly strongly defined, and boundaries between genders are also fairly strongly defined. As a woman, I have probably more access to the community as a whole than if I were a man, because if I were a man, I probably wouldn't have access to women in the community, in many communities, or the same kind of ease of access to women. I think that is all. I don't think that there is anything else that differentiates a writer, a storyteller, and their role, their participation, or their witness, right, of violence. I think that from my experience with people with whom I've kind of grown up professionally, men and women, my experience is that war accumulates, the violence, the wound accumulates, and the moral injury accumulates, regardless of our gender, and it becomes harder and harder to re-enter a conflict. It becomes harder and harder to witness a conflict. It becomes harder and harder to even, I can't really even watch moving images from a conflict. I know what it looks like. It's enough for me to read the paper to imagine what it actually looks like and smells like on the ground. But I do not think that that's a gender, I really don't think that it's a gender question. What the question is that I have is, what do readers get when women write about war as opposed to when men write about war? Do readers, do you trust us more? Do you trust us less? Do you think that we navigate conflict in a kind of a different way? Do you look for different things in women writing about war than if you were reading Michael Herr? That's the question I think that's interesting here, because how we perceive what women's work, right, in our patriarchal society, still patriarchal society, regardless of my ability to write about war, Tamta's ability to write about war, the question is, do you trust our work to be as valuable? Do you trust our work to be more valuable than, a male counterpart, and especially a male counterpart who is a legend? And also, since women writers are only read if they're publishers, do publishers believe that we're as trustworthy narrators as men in our same profession are? Do publishers believe me if I write a war novel? Do they promote it in the same way if I were Dexter Filkins who wrote a war novel, right? So those are the kind of the questions that your question raises for me.
Thank you. Very, very important. Lusine, Marjan, Tamta, do you have thoughts about this? Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that, thinking about are there differences. I think, when there was a lot of fighting around our house, I remember, just my observation, not necessarily a reflection on actual sex or gender differences, but it occurred to me the men immediately get very excited. And their reaction to everything that's happening is very action-oriented, and you can see they're all worked up. And the interesting thing is the opposite thing happened to me. I became very numb and introverted and emotionally disconnected. And I'm not sure if this is necessarily the case with all women, but I wasn't in an action mode, I was in the opposite, and I was in survival mode, and my particular approach to survival was to shut down.
Tamta?
Well, for me, let's say that I immediately felt this trust from the reader, the trust you were talking about. Because in my case, I showed young women's perspective of the war, which was, at least in Georgian literature by then, totally invisible, totally unknown. And it touched so much the reader and the critics as well that, yes, so maybe my case was something different, but I felt really connected with my reader, and I really felt this, that what I was experiencing or was feeling when I was writing the text, actually the same experiences and feelings belonged to the reader.
What about the issue of whose stories? Lusine, did you have something you wanted to add?
Not something very specific, but I think as gender is one of your most important identities, it's important to have that voice as well. So it really makes sense from which position you are writing. And it's about not only being trusted by reader or publisher, but it is also about having that perspective also in there. Otherwise, it has been, well, literature has been male-dominated for centuries, not only literature about war. So it's a perspective that hasn't been really there, apart from diaries, probably, if you look, which is something very personal, and it's something that existed really longer, and you will see a lot of women writing in diaries and letters, but you wouldn't see as much in literature, like for really long periods. So I think, yes, it really makes difference, because here it's not it's a different perspective. It's an important identity that should be there, and from that perspective, war should be also narrated in a way that would be different from the other perspective. Particularly motherhood is something which is very much personal and related to womenhood. And because if you look at countries like ours, where really young childs are dying in the war, like they are 18, 19 years old, it's a perspective of a mother who raises a child, and then child dies in the war, which, for example, and not only like Tamta's literature is about teenage girls, which is a very important thing. In addition, motherhood is an experience that can also speak about war differently.
We're having this panel in the United States at the moment, and the United States exports almost 40% of the world's weaponry used in warfare. An interesting fact is also that, as our panelists were born in other countries, and some work in other languages, the United States publishes only 3% of works published in the United States are works in translation. This is just to lead into a question that you can approach in any way you wish, but what about the issue of whose stories get told and have been told? And how is that shifting with with having more women reflecting on war, experiencing war, and reporting from war? Do you have thoughts?
Actually, yes, because I think that Russia and Russian literature is known more in the West, whatever is the West in a wider sense, because it's a major language, unlike us, who are small countries. For example, Georgian and Armenian is spoken by 3-4 million of people, right? Because of many reasons, we are so much underrepresented on a literary scene because of the language and because of the many other things. But for a long time, even in the during the Soviet times, actually what was considered Soviet, it was Russian. So there were Russian-centered narratives everywhere dominating, even in the academia, even in literature. So I think that if our voices are heard, like voices from small nations from the former Soviet Union, like Armenia and Georgia, apart from other nations like Ukraine, you here in the West, you will get a large-scale picture of the whole setting, I mean. And also we will have the feeling that we are heard. And I think that literature and art is the best way to give the sense for you of this full-scale picture. Sorry for my English. I hope at least you understood.
Absolutely. Thank you. Anna, do you have any thoughts about this? Or Marjan? Or
Yeah, you know, it's interesting, this idea of art and literature is the way to deal with it. I mean, I guess I'm self-published with the art pieces, but you know, it wasn't my intention to do the writing. I mean, that was the bizarre part of it. I was sort of creating these pieces with a creative stream of consciousness flow. And the thing that really impacted me is right before I did the heavy embedded writing and Shot in Iran, David and Goliath, some of my better known big prints, I had been to the Rubin Museum to see the Red Book of Carl Jung. And that had a really profound effect on me because it was almost like an illuminated manuscript where he examined the mythology of his own life in order to find that meaning. And the approach he took was so free and so unrestrained. It didn't fit the format of writing. It didn't fit the format of art. He invented his own art form. And so I had this idea that I wanted to do the same thing with digital art. And so the way, I mean, Shot in Iran has probably over 3,000 words in it. It's about a massacre, senseless, I should add, massacre of soldiers that I witnessed. And the way that happened is, you know, I rendered the main composition of the figures at a very high resolution, and as I was cleaning it up, it came. You know, first little fragments of prose, and I would embed them. And then slowly it was like a paragraph of writing. And then before I know it, it became 3 columns of text. The first column was the massacre, the senseless massacre. The second column was, you know, my family breaking apart and never really quite coming back together again. You know, some families go through trauma, they get stronger. Ours just fell apart. And you know, the third column was how I discovered punk rock saved my life. Because I was like a 19-year-old traumatized girl, and the rage and anger of punk rock gave me a way to scream and feel okay and find a tribe that was as crazy as I was. And yeah, I actually had to write about that. And at the bottom, I wrote about the Fellowship of Refugees in New York City. You know, the cab drivers, the falafel guy, all the people I've talked to. And, you know, we all come from different countries. There's like the secret club of us when we talk, where are you from? And then, of course, inevitably, what happened to you in your country? And there's this like strange experience that happens because we really connect over trauma and dislocation. And it's so weird to find a bond in that that's powerful and meaningful. And it's like a reminder that, you know, everybody experiences loss and trauma in their own way, even if they haven't endured war. But it's strange how that can bring us together in these incredibly powerful ways. And that's the shocking part of it, that you end up losing your family and your country, and then suddenly with a stranger you have such deep connection. And that's the irony. That's the irony of these types of experiences.
I would like to go back again to that 3% thing. It is always about our positions. Like, well, English is the biggest language, and it is always, at least in very recent times and even longer, there was no real war in the US, and it's always somehow a distance perspective into the war. Well, you have army here and there, but from where you are positioned, it is really distanced. So, and when you have only, like, major part of US market is English, obviously, and it should be like that, but then you never have these bodily, very close experiences that other people have in other regions, and it is always speaking about things from distance and from power position. So it is very much about who has the power to create a narrative. And it becomes so that even the narratives about war are created in English language and are created by those who have a power to create that narratives. So giving more voice to smaller languages is important for really, I mean, I know everybody knows it here, but it is always like feeling you are in the margins when you are not heard at all and your story is not out there. And it's not only about being marginalized as woman who writes or doesn't write about war necessarily, but it's also about being really marginalized in terms of being heard. Your narratives are usually under bigger narratives that are created by bigger languages and those who have the position of power. I think that's, from my perspective, that is something that needs to be also critically thought through, and that is why it is important to have bigger percent of translated literature in the US.
Can I piggyback on that a second? I also think it is important to consider, since we're talking about this country, because we're here. I think it's important to consider that this country is a country at war, and has been a country at war for 400 years since the conception of this country. And the only reason that's not the narrative, the dominant narrative in this country, is because of who's telling the story, right? Like the Chinua Achebe said, the story of the lion hunt is always told by the hunter. And there is a whole slew of people who experience violence on the daily basis and who expect violence on the daily basis in this city, in this country. And a lot of people are telling stories, and still we pretend that there is no war against black and brown people in this country, or no war against women in this country. So I don't know how that ties into the gender question, but I do think that there's always never enough storytelling. There's always never enough storytelling from the non-dominant story, from the non-hunter.
How does your next project or book summon you? This is the question that's given from the audience. While we're taking these questions, I also invite the panelists to question each other. If anything that anyone has said has inspired you to ask each other something. But if you're willing to talk about how the next work comes to you, this would be the time to do that. That is our question from the audience.
I usually get hijacked.
Hijacked.
Literally
Okay.
hijacked. You know, it's like I'm modeling, I'm animating, and then it's like I get sucked into something. It's like I got to follow the thread and see where it goes. And then I'm just, you know, next thing you know, it's like 3 weeks later and Marjan has a finished piece, you know.
The wonderful writer Jericho Brown, who's a friend of mine, once said, you have to look at your notes for the last 4 years and find out what you're thinking about. So I've discovered that I've been thinking a lot about migration and displacement and memory. And so that's what's summoning me right now to write a novel about, and violence. So I'm writing a novel that kind of works around all of these 4 things and how permeable memory is, and how we can't rely on it, and how we push one another out of the way, politically, geographically. So I think the best way of imagining the next work is realizing what are you actually thinking about.
Well, apart from my first book, I wrote 2 more novels, which have totally different topics. But quite recently, I realized that still you can feel and you can read the echoes of the war in those two novels. And I very much want not to define myself or to be defined as the writer circulating around the war. But still, it seems that it's there.
Lusine, would you like to talk about that?
It depends. Sometimes it could be like something you really have to do, otherwise you can't continue working or doing your usual things. But sometimes it could be something very unexpected, like you end up in a conversation, and then from that conversation you get this feeling that there is something you need to do about something about. So every time it's different, but then you also feel like you are hijacked by it, and then until you are done, there is no way you get out of that story.
Carolyn, how did you get hijacked by your latest project that you that made you put a book together in 5 months? Which is, by the way, a magazine deadline, not a book deadline.
Right. It was a little anthology, but I've always been hijacked. The doorbell has always rung, and I don't say no. Yeah. And when someone comes into my life or presents something, I do it. And that's what has shaped all of my work. And the recent one is, of course, the present period of the war in Ukraine. The invasion of February 24th, 2022, which was an extension of the war that began in 2014. I had insomnia, and so did my friend Ilya Kaminsky. And so we were writing to each other in our insomnia, texting and emailing about what was going on in Ukraine, and following the war closely. And another Ukrainian American, Askol Melnichek, who was the publisher of Aerosmith Press, came to us and said, we have to do something. So we proposed an anthology of Ukrainian poets writing in the present. And he said, 50 pages, 5 months, cram as many poets as you can into it, and I've got to have everything done and ready to go to the printer in 5 months. So this was the fastest book I've ever done. It's being launched tomorrow night in New York, and it's been a very moving, very engaging. It's taken hold of my soul. We even wrote the introduction together back and forth in emails. So this anthology made itself happen. It's writing in an emergency. It's composed of poets who were gathered all the while their country was being shelled and bombarded, invaded, while civilian populations were being attacked, and so on. So this was something that we had in mind the entire time we were working on it. That's my newest piece.
And it's, I think, on sale out front.
Oh, thank you, Anna. We're getting some questions that we've touched on. What do you think you can offer the public that male reporters can't? What female spaces are critical to access in humanitarian emergencies? Does anyone have anything to add to what's already been said?
Kitchens. Pantries, babies, babies in bellies, women's bodies, women's health. when there is a real war emergency, like what we're observing in Sudan right now, or probably what we're also witnessing in Ukraine, women's bodies are the last thing that gets attended to, because all medical professionals that are left are attending to the wounded. So, and the women traditionally are in charge of the pantry. They're the ones who are keeping food and keeping their families fed. And in my experience, men often don't know what's in the pantry. So, also in this country, true.
That's true. Or what to do with it if they found it.
Although I was just going to say, in all fairness, my husband does all the shopping and cooking, so I'm the one that never knows what's in the pantry.
What steps do you take to, or recommend, to continue to center joy and the wellspring of creativity and love within each of you as you write about and or live with violence, war, fear? How do you keep yourself going, I think, is what this question is about.
You know, I'm going to speak to that because, you know, I met with one of the lead research people at Columbia Center for Complicated Grief. And, you know, she interviewed me. And at this point, I've lost my whole family, both siblings and parents. And, you know, I tried to have children and lost those. It didn't work out. And so I have a lot of loss. My whole life is loss. And I know what it's like to sometimes wake up and say it's like my pleasure chip is broken. Like I look at other human beings, you know, they can have these joys that I don't seem to have. And I deal with that all the time, like during the holidays, or, you know, you see families like, oh, I don't have this. Whatever it is these people are experiencing, I don't have. But I told the lead researcher that she said, is there something that gives you joy? I said, yeah, my work, if you can believe that. And she goes, do you have any idea how lucky you are? She goes, I work with people who've had 1/10 the loss you've had, and they don't even have that. There's nothing in this life that gives them joy. And, you know, sometimes I think of the Joseph Campbell line, because I think everybody misquotes it. Everybody says, oh, you know, follow your bliss. But it's the sentence continues after that, because Joseph Campbell didn't say just follow your bliss. He said follow your bliss, and then when you lose everything, you will still have your bliss. In other words, he's trying to tell you life sucks. I mean, there's suffering as part of life. And sometimes, you know, we have to find that thing that engages us in a way that gives understanding and meaning to the suffering. I hate to say it, it's such a cliche, but it's true. And I think the arts and literature, as was brought up, and I think it's, you know, as women and as men, we have to look and say, what is it that allows me to make sense out of everything that's happening to me and everything that has happened to me? And the bottom line is, don't give up. Every human being has that. It's not just your fingerprint that's truly unique. It's that gift you can offer yourself in the world that nobody else can, that's equally as unique. So we all possess that capacity. It's just a question of giving voice to it and expressing it.
The ability to laugh at myself. That is what makes me going.
Anyone else?
I think it's also hope, because in Georgia we're sometimes, in most times, we're inadequately hopeful, and we still enjoy our life. Okay, we had these tragic and heavy experiences, but still we continue to live, love, create, procreate, and so on. So, yes, it's very important what Marjan was telling about the joy, and about all the driving forces we have, which are stronger than the war.
It's my feeling that we don't recover from the traumatic experience of warfare. We don't get over it, although that is the obsession of the culture here. There's no such thing as that. We live in the aftermath. and we do what we can. That is my feeling. And this question might be for you, Anna, because it concerns news organizations for whom you have worked in the past. How do the news organizations fulfill their responsibilities for duty of care with unique stressors of this work in mind? Do they? And if they do, would you like to say something about that?
First of all, I wanted to say to the person who asked the previous question that it's such a beautiful question, and it's asking that question that keeps me going. I ask that question of myself and of others as often as I can when I remember. So thank you for reminding me, whoever it was. I'm grateful. So I had an editor when I was 25 years old, and I had a 3-year-old at home and a 4-year-old stepson. And he was sending me, although I was the only war correspondent on staff for the San Francisco Chronicle at the time. And so he was sending a mail over the world in rapid fire succession, pardon the pun. And it was exhilarating, of course, because I was young and I was trusted, and I know that I did my work well, and I felt that I was doing something meaningful, and I wanted to keep doing it, and I wanted to be better at it, and I wanted to do as well as I could by the people who entrusted their stories to me, or aspects of their stories to me. And then I left the paper, and then many years had passed, and then about 12 to 15 years later, he and I reconnected, and he's an old man and retired. And he started, he started talking to me, and very tenderly, and came to visit me once with his wife, and in the conversation called me his greatest accomplishment. I had just won the Guggenheim, not because of him. I was, talk about commodification. I didn't know what to say. His wife was there. If it weren't for her, but I didn't want to be disrespectful. But after he left and they left, I wanted to ask him, what the hell was he thinking sending a child to war over and over? Yes, I did it very well, and I was, maybe the best reporter in the paper at the time, but who cares? Like, could I have sent a young person? Could I have sent anybody? A few months ago, a magazine asked me to put together a collage of writers about Ukraine, or writers from Ukraine writing about the environmental fallout of the war. And I found myself editing people who were writing from an active war zone. And I kept thinking of that question again. And the gentleman had suffered a severe and very rapid dementia, so I will never ask him this question. Does that answer yours? I hope it does. It's such a huge responsibility to ask of anyone to risk the rest of their lives. And not just the rest of my life, it's also the rest of the lives of my children, right? Who would watch me leave and wait for me to come back and listen to the news in the meantime. But having said that, I did it of my own volition, and I did it by choice. And I always, thank God, had the opportunity to leave. And there are so many people who don't. And there are so many people who don't, and we change the channel, and we get over it, and we flick over to the next conflict, and the next, and the next. And that, I think, is one of the reasons, and I'm not going to speak for everybody here, but definitely the reason I keep writing is because I want us to remember, however fallible our memories are.
I think that's a lovely note to end on. And I want to thank all of you for being here with us today, and thank you for coming. Thank you very much.